In the newsletter, you talked about how fear has been a harder one to tackle.
Mm.
Could you talk a little bit more about why fear is complicated?
Yeah, fear is tied. It's not just an emotional response. You do have like issues in your brain. Mostly, I mean, there's several things, but like one big thing to tackle is the thing called the amygdala. And part of the amygdala is the stronger the emotion, the more that the amygdala gets imprinted on. And so if you think about, even when you have really positive experiences, it imprints on the amygdala. But the tendency is that the stronger emotions are usually things that are upsetting. It stirs up more lower emotion. And so we tend to have more imprints from negative things than positive. And then anything that we think repetitively also imprints on the amygdala. More emotion than mental, but still it's in play. And so you want to be able to calm down the agitation in the amygdala and then kind of release some of that imprint. And when you go through and you start to release the imprint, it's not so much about I'm feeling anxious and I need to do something right here, right now. It's more of like I want to break down the pattern of being anxious because it becomes a pattern like in the physiology. It becomes a pattern in not just your emotional patterns and your mind, but how your mind processes things from the environment is kind of through the lens of fear a bit. And you're just like, oh, if I relax, the other shoe's going to drop. It's kind of like what we were talking about with who were we talking about that with just a little bit ago. Oh yeah, Megan. God, why I'm spaced out there. But like she feels good, and then all of a sudden it feels like something comes up, right? It's like in that state of relaxation, there's still this like kind of imprint that's a bit deeper. And so it's not just about, oh, how do I reduce fear? It's basically like, how do I clean out this pipeline of stuff that just gets spread out through the physiology of what about rejection? What about the unknown? What about I've had these past experiences and every time I do this, certain things happen, or I had a bad experience one time, or certain phobias. A lot of times when we think of phobias, it's very specific. I'm afraid of spiders. I'm afraid of leaving the house. I'm afraid of driving at night. I'm afraid of fill in the blank. And those are very defined phobias, where you have a response where you get triggered and you're having this response or this like fear, like anxiety or panic that comes from it. But there are also non-specific tendencies that have to do with phobias that affect how you think, but you don't have a thing to identify like, oh, it's spiders. Oh, it's mice. Oh, it's, fill in the blank. And uh, it's a way to undo. It's not a thing. It's a flow. Like fear is more about adjusting the flow of something rather than I'm afraid of spiders. What do I do about spiders? It's like, how do you get to that place where you're freaked out by spiders? It's not about the spider itself. It's about not driving at night itself. It's the flow of how did I get there to where I'm upset at night. Could be that maybe the eyesight might not be the best, or you knew somebody who got into an accident, or you had a near thing happen at night, or you don't feel comfortable at nighttime, or it's hard to say. But there's a flow that gets you there, and it's about changing the flows that get you to that place. It's like calibrating the flows so that things don't really affect you the same way. So that means calming down the adrenals, calming down and reducing some of the impact on the cardiac muscle, the heart, clearing up the amygdala, and also creating that space between you and the event, so that then when all that kind of calms down, you're able to go through and systematically treat each one of these kind of different fear responses. So, yeah. I was doing some, because it's like old notes. And so I was like pulling it out and looking at the notes again. And I was like, oh, I'm going to do a little bit on myself. And I was doing things on phobias. And I really don't have like a phobia. Like, I'm not afraid of spiders or whatever. I started doing the phobias and I was like, man, like my mind is changing. Like I'm clearing up. There was a tension or a low grade anxiety that I didn't even realize that I had. And then all of a sudden I realized I am sleeping better. I am like, when it's nighttime and it's like, okay, it's a certain time, it's time for me to go to bed. Boom, I'm sleeping longer, I'm sleeping deeper. And like, I can't say that I treated a specific phobia, but there's that flow that would get me to the phobia. And when I was younger, I had several phobias, the big one was when I was young, rock climbing. And I was like 20 or something. I made myself, or not rock climbing, heights, but I made myself go rock climbing because I was like, I have to conquer this fear. It just made me have anxiety up on the rock, right? I don't know how well that worked, but even way back in the day, talking to more than one or two people at a time, I used to have a phobia about it. Like I did not like to talk in public, but I mean, obviously I've gotten over it, but it took like some work. And then, I started taking that and making kind of a systematic approach. And then when I was working with the psychologist, we kept going down that rabbit hole. And a lot of times when we were treating deep psychological issues with people, we treat it as, symptoms, but sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't. But when it stepped back and look, sometimes it was stress oriented, sometimes it was trauma oriented, but a lot of times we had to go deep on fears. And it just affected how the person processed the environment, and then the inability to go inward. And you could say like certain kinds of anxieties and panics are like a disconnect from like an inner awareness. Like there's just like, even in Buddhism, they'll say like fears and things are lack or a disconnect from a certain kind of awareness. And we all have them. We just try to connect and have awareness with that particular issue. The thing with plants is it can shift your mind and your physiology very quickly, where you don't have to just sit and observe the issue for long periods of time. You can use a plant to shift it. In Buddhism would use mantra, but here we're using plant. And actually in the class, there is a little like a phrase, like a little affirmation that is a phrase out of Psalms, and there is a thing to tone for each one of them. So you could treat it with a tone, you have an affirmation, and then you have an oil. So